Thank you very much, Mr. Chancellor, and for Dean Scott for very generous words. I have always wanted to be a graduate of a really good university, and now I almost are one. And of course, I join in the congratulations to the sea of graduates sitting here, awaiting the end of this ceremony, and to their long-suffering parents. I have to say the law graduates are more suffering than the others because they had to listen to me this morning, and 2 doses of Binnie in one day can be excruciating. But as I told the graduates this morning, I was going to take a topic and argue one way this morning and the other way this afternoon. And the topic is actually the title of a book by Leonard Woolf, Virginia Woolf's husband, which is that it is the journey, not the arrival, that matters. And in taking the affirmative this morning to a rather cynical group of law graduates, I emphasized the importance of the quality of the journey through life and the importance of self-promotion and puffery and opportunism. But I thought that might be too cynical for the engineering students who tend to be more serious about these things. Because for the students from engineering turning around the proposition that the arrival is more important, my understanding is that it's, for example, not only important that you have fun building the bridge, but that the bridge actually stands up once you've finished. At least most bridges, most of the time. And on the face of it, trying to bring the disparate groups here together, the graduates in the physical engineering sciences have an advantage over the social engineers from the law department. Firstly, once you solve a problem, it stays solved. One of the great engineers that I'm sure is well known to you, whose work is Isambard Brunel, created 150 years ago what was then the longest suspension span bridge in the world, and it is still there. Of all the millions of words poured out in the legal system from Brunel's time, I suggest that perhaps a few hundred are still remembered with any affection. The social engineering side that the lawyers participate in has been seeking since the time of Hammurabi to get straight a few basic issues, such as the balance between the power of the state and the rights of the individual. I like to think that we are doing better, but there is no arrival in sight. Another advantage of the physical engineers is the endurance of your works. The law is continually reinventing itself, and no matter how close we think we are to achieving a solution, it inevitably unravels in the next generation, if not few years. And thirdly, the engineering graduates have the advantage of a career that will be held in high esteem by the public. The lawyers, unfortunately, are right down there with the politicians and the journalists. When I ceased to be a judge on October 20th, as Ian Scott mentioned, I went from 3rd place to 32nd place overnight in public standing. So what can be said in favor of the social engineers, the lawyers. Well, the first thing is that whether you like it or not, you are going to be engulfed in the legal system for the rest of your natural lives. There is no escape from the lawyers. We may not be part of your world, but I can assure you, you will be part of ours. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is this joint venture that we have as members of the same society, each making our own contribution in our own way, and what you as new graduates would like to see as society over the next 50 years. Now, I had once a brush with greatness. This was not as a lawyer or a judge, but as a student journalist over 50 years ago when I was at Cambridge and interviewed Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was not then the superstar that he became. Otherwise, I'm sure he wouldn't have bothered to speak to me. But he was giving a speech in London about the struggles in the southern United States and about the power conflicts between Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and the people who were advocating a more violent approach as compared with Dr. King's nonviolent, Gandhi-esque approach. And when I concluded my interview, I said, now, do you have anything you'd like to say to the students at Cambridge? And he said, well, not really. So my great punchline for my article went nowhere. But really what he was saying is, look, I've got enough on my plate. You know, I'm really not interested in what your problems are. You deal with your problems, I'll deal with mine. And he went on, and when we talk about a point of arrival, his whole existence was sort of one step forward, two steps backward. A few years, he was only 10 years older than I was at the time. And he had been through the great Birmingham bus boycott in 1955. 2 years later was the March on Washington, after I had interviewed him when he gave his I Have a Dream speech that established him for all time in the consciousness of Americans and others. The Nobel Prize and the Civil Rights Act were still in the future, but having accomplished all of this as one of the great social engineers of our era, of course it all began to unravel in the what became known as Bloody Sunday on the march across the bridge in Selma, Alabama. And then, of course, in 1968, he was assassinated. So unlike, you know, the engineers who build things to last, and once the principle is learned, it is there for everybody to use forever, there is this terrible slipping and sliding in the social sciences that we can really do nothing about. I mentioned Hammurabi's Code of 1772 BC, a long time ago, dealing with many of the same issues that our society is dealing with today. Let's go forward to 1772 AD and a case called Somersets case in Britain, having to do with slavery, an issue dealt with Hammurabi a couple of thousand years previously. Somersets case had to do with whether an Englishman could own property in another human being located in England. This was a slave who'd been brought over from Boston by his owner, who had escaped and who was put back on a ship to be taken back to the United States in chains, and a habeas corpus was applied for, and it came before the court. And Lord Mansfield, in quite a remarkable judgment, drawing really on nothing. He was a commercial judge. He wasn't what would today be called a human rights kind of guy. Declared that the air of England is too pure for a slave to breathe. But having established that principle again in building a society, of course, the fine words didn't go very far. There was slavery that continued for another 61 years, even within the British dominions, and even recognized within Britain itself. So there is always this difference, which I'm going to come to towards the end of my remarks, between the air war, which I'm borrowing from the politicians, but the war of words, to get it straight in principle, and the ground war, which we're all part of in attempting to implement a vision of a proper, just society. Well, of course, these issues are still with us. The United Nations says human trafficking, which is another word for slavery, is one of the largest global problems that we have. So this is 1772 to 2012, and these problems, regardless of what the judges say and the lawyers say and the politicians say and the international organizations say, on the ground, things have not improved to the extent one would have expected. A few years earlier than Somersets' case was the great case of the prohibitions, where there was a struggle between the Lord Chief Justice of England and King James over whether the king could unilaterally decide the law. The king's perspective was, you exercise your power as the king's judges as my delegate. I, as the principal, can exercise that power myself. And Lord Chief Justice Cook said, no, you can't. That the law is for the judges to determine, not for the king. The king owes his power to the law, not the other way around. Well, was that problem solved? It was identified. Lord Cook had the fine words, but are we still not in this problem with the anti-terrorism legislation? What is Guantanamo, other than an effort by the executive, in this case the President of the United States, to run an operation outside the supervision of the courts? I, the President, will decide what rights these people have, not the courts, which is exactly the issue that Lord Cook was dealing with a couple of hundred years ago. Then the great case of Entick and Carrington, back in 1765. That was a matter of sedition. John Wilkes, most of you will know of John Wilkes and his pamphleteering, and this is in the lead up to the American Revolution. There was a messenger sent out from the king to seize the papers of Mr. Entick. And Mr. Entick was a private citizen. His door was broken down. Papers were seized. It came before the courts. In one of the really great judgments of our legal history, Lord Cobden said, if the king has the authority to enter your house, let it be shown in the books where that authority lies. The state can only do what it is positively authorized to do, and nothing more. On the other hand, the ordinary person can do anything the ordinary person wishes to do, except that which is specifically prohibited. And Camden said, if it is the law, it will be found in our books. If it is not found there, it is not the law. Well, Dean Scott referred to my sojourn in the Department of Justice in the early 80s, and we were still arguing over what was called writs of assistance, under which the RCMP could enter premises on reasonable grounds to look for drugs. reasonable grounds, which of course the RCMP in their wisdom would in the first instance formulate. So here's a principle that had been laid down for over 200 years, still being argued about in Canada after the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So where does this bring us? I've suggested that in the hard sciences, in the engineering and the work that you do, there seems to be immense progress. What is pushing the barriers of nanotechnology and the rest of it is simply mind-boggling. Whereas in building a kind of society that we want to live in, we seem to circle around. We don't make a complete circle. There's a bit of a spiral, a bit of an uptick from generation to generation. But we are far from solving the basic problems, although I think we are doing a better job than we did before. But it is fragile. And this is the responsibility which you will all have as our generation throws the somewhat tattered torch to you as you embark on your careers. And there are issues that you are going to have to individually make up your mind what kind of society you want. Anti-terrorism. Where is the correct balance? Do you want to live in a society where the state says security above all, and we will do whatever is necessary to track down whoever we think we need to track down in order to protect against a terrorist attack? Police powers, and these are issues that have all come before the Supreme Court when I was sitting on the court. Police powers. The theory going back to that case in 1772 was that if it is the law, it will be in the books. There will be a statute authorizing the police to break down the door or to conduct criminal investigation one way or another. We don't have those laws in Canada. Canada relies largely on the common law of police powers, which are largely undefined. And this is in contrast to most jurisdictions in the common law world, where the parliamentarians, the representatives, the democratic voice have said the police can go this far and no further. But what happens in Canada? For example, we had a case in the schools where the police went in with dogs to sniff for drugs. Well, do you want a society in which the dogs are let loose in schools, in public places, in Convocation Hall, as you come in the door? Do you want to be sniffed by police dogs, or don't you? If your absolute priority is the war on drugs, then you'll say, yes, let the police do whatever they think they have to do. But is that the kind of society you want? And if it isn't, are you prepared to stand up for your beliefs and to push for a more open, more civil liberties-oriented place to live? CCTV cameras. Britain is just covered with them. You can't go anywhere without being caught on video. When something happens in London, on the news, within hours, you've got footage of Mr. So-and-so going in this tube station and out that tube station and walking down this street. Hundreds of cameras, very sophisticated software that can identify facial features and bring all of this together within a matter of hours. Do you want to live in that kind of society? It's not my society. I'm on the way out, as Ian Scott kindly put it. But you're not. And you're going to have to make up your own minds. Are these things important to you? And are you prepared to stand up and be counted? And are you prepared to say, I want to be free of this kind of supervision by the state, and if it means that we pay a price in terms of law enforcement, so be it. This is the kind of society that I want to live in. I referred to Somersets' case on the slavery issue. Is the issue of equality of races, has that really been solved? Is there racism in Canada? Well, of course there's racism in Canada. Is it as bad as it was in 1772? No, of course not. Progress has been made, but it is an ongoing battle. It is not going to be fought by the lawyers and the judges. It's going to be what society wants, what you as individuals, the kind of place that you want to live. So my parting thought to you is that, you know, the air war has been won. There are United Nations conventions against almost every possible affliction of society running on for hundreds of pages. There are the law books. We have the Charter. We have international conventions. We have the European Court of Human Rights. Everybody is saying the right things. Almost everybody. But what's happening on the ground? Has the society moved to the point where you're going to feel comfortable when you look back at 50 years' experience, as I do now? Will society have evolved in the way of more state authority, more intrusion, less privacy? The internet, of course, a vast engine for collecting information on everybody in this room, which can then be sold on to consumers of that kind of data. So I say the principles that we're talking about of the kind of society, an open society, are established. It is not achieved. We have not arrived. We are still on the journey. The arrival, to me, is of crucial importance. This is the work of your generation, and I say to you, good luck.